Timothy Colton, you provide a very stimulating analysis of Poroshenko's victory based on regional data. Could you tell us more about it?
Sure. So we, once it became clear that dramatic events were unfolding in Ukraine and that part of the solution to the crisis would be in elections that everybody hoped would be fair elections, we thought we would take advantage of this moment and try and study what was actually going on. So we formed a small team, 4 of us, 2 of us actually of Ukrainian background, the other 2 not, including me. And we found Ukrainian colleagues to work with, and then we, one place or another, found the money to fund this. And we did a very large survey of a sample of about 2,000 Ukrainian voting-age citizens in 3 waves. The third wave is about to begin. The first wave was before May 25th, before Poroshenko's election. The second wave after the election, so we could hear how people had voted, understand how people had voted. And the third wave will be after the Rada election. So the data that we have generated, I think, is fairly close to unique. And we're going to make it available to members of the Ukrainian studies community as soon as we can manage to do that.
So what are the main factors that explain Poroshenko's victory?
Well, it's a very good question, which we're wrestling with. You know, when somebody receives 55% of the popular vote, he's, clearly gaining a very broad base of support. And when you look back, I mean, who would have thought a year ago that Poroshenko was ever going to be president of Ukraine, let alone winning with almost 60% of the popular vote. He, in fact, got 1% more than Putin got in Russia in 2000, who had all the power of the state machine behind him. And so breadth is really the big characteristic. I refer to Poroshenko as an electoral omnivore. That is, he managed to feast in almost every group. And although there certainly is some variation, for example, he generally did it rather better among older voters than among younger voters. He is not the candidate of youth. But nonetheless, even among Ukrainians under the age of 30, he still receives a very large plurality of the votes. He gets as many votes as everybody else put together. So that's kind of the way it looked. And therefore, as it became clear that this was the case, we started to fumble around for other explanations for this phenomenon that had to do with the context in particular. And one thing I noted in my talk this afternoon was that when you ask voters themselves why they voted, which is not the only way to approach this kind of analysis, but we thought it would be a useful supplement. It turns out that a lot of people, that there were many explanations that they gave for Poroshenko, whereas some other candidates had only one thing or 2 things. His personality was part of it. His program, to a very limited extent, I'm not sure people even knew what his program was. But also we found this very interesting thing, which was that about a quarter, 20 or 25% of his supporters said the main reason they voted for him was that they wanted a candidate to win in the first round. So I think there was a kind of rallying around the front runner in a moment of national, almost panic, I suppose, like Ukraine has been in for the last year. And that just by being the front runner, by being relatively untarnished by all that had happened since last November, he was a kind of Teflon candidate, it seems, and was maybe the only one left standing when everybody else had kind of been knocked away by one thing or another. So that's not necessarily bad. Was it, relatively fair and free election? He's got 5 years to govern the country. But, I'm not sure he has much of a mandate to do anything in particular, just to be president. So the interesting part of the story, the next interesting part of the story really starts now.
But the comparison with Putin is quite disturbing. We knew what happened 14 years later. Is there a risk of the same evolution with Poroshenko?
Well, I think there's always a risk. I shared with the audience some information about Ukrainians' ambivalence towards democracy. People, they think democracy is a good thing, but so do most Russians. They also think a strong leader who doesn't have to worry about elections and parties, many Ukrainians, not a majority quite, but a large number of them, think that's a good idea too. So I wouldn't expect Ukraine to follow the Russian path, but it is certainly interesting that Poroshenko is the first Ukrainian president to be elected with a victory in the first round since Kravchuk in 1991. That's a long time ago. So there's something about the moment that's created this opportunity. You know, in the end, I think Ukrainians are more distrustful of authority. You know, there is a Ukrainian political culture which is very skeptical about government, which will go along with a certain line of policy for a while. People get disillusioned, they get tired, they want to change. So that's how you can have Kravchuk losing an election, Yushchenko getting 5% of the vote, the incumbent, in 2010. Yanukovych would have lost the election if he hadn't been ousted earlier. And Poroshenko, I think, will have to deal with the same set of circumstances. And given the fact that Ukraine's economic situation is so dire, given the fact that it's basically still in this strange hybrid war situation with Russia, you know, this may come to a head sooner rather than later.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.